Sony makes mistakes and none of them want you to remember it. Hi folks, it's Falcon, and today on GameRanks, 10 Sony mistakes they want you to forget. Starting off at number 10, they want you to forget how mediocre the PlayStation Classic was. Now, it's not exactly the most complicated console ever made, and once you get into a game, it's not bad or anything. I mean, except for with some games like Ridge Racer, you can hack an SNES Classic and it plays it better than the PlayStation. But whatever, let's just talk about what games you get. Some good ones, got Metal Gear Solid, Final Fantasy VII, Tekken 3, Oddworld, but notable exceptions are Crash Bandicoot and Spyro the Dragon, which aren't there. Also, weirdly enough, both of those are owned by Activision now and have both gotten remakes on newer consoles. And yes, particularly with Spyro, there is significant improvement in the remake, particularly with the camera system. That doesn't mean nobody wants to try it. And hey, Ape Escape isn't there, despite the fact that Sony completely owns that. Why was Ape Escape not on this thing? And yeah, the original Resident Evil is on there, but there were 3 Resident Evils on the PlayStation, 3 of them. Also upscaling. What's upscaling? And at number 9, they'd like you to forget that for a very, very long time you were unable to change your PlayStation ID. And by a very long time, I mean up until April 2019. Which is just a very strange thing considering there's very few services at all that don't let you change your name, and your PlayStation Network account stays persistent between console generations. You'd think you'd get the opportunity to change it. Nope, like such a basic feature should never be described as highly anticipated, but I remember seeing articles from quite a few different places saying exactly that. And when they finally did make it so you can change your PSN ID, guess what it did? It screwed up some games. There were a lot of games with minor issues, like having to reconfigure your controller, which would reset to default state. And then there were some that would just outwardly get rid of your in-game currency, in-game progress. Totally, basically, screw you, even if you spend money. Yep, that shouldn't have happened with even a single game. Moving on to number 8, way back in 2006 when the new PlayStation 3 was coming, they introduced the 6-axis controller. It was called the 6-axis controller because it had motion sensitivity, which, yeah, that's cool. Not the most important thing in a video game controller, but I'm not against it. The thing is that motion sensing came at the expense of rumble, which is a very well-liked feature if you did not know. Sony was like, yeah, that's a feature from the past. People aren't gonna want that. And people were like, we do want that. And also, no one really made games that needed motion control. Sony included it in Uncharted, and it was probably the most irritating aspect of Uncharted, and they got rid of it for the second Uncharted because it was the most irritating part of Uncharted. The reason why they decided to do this was there's a lawsuit going on between Immersion, the company that owns the patents for force feedback, and Sony. And just a couple days after they were like, that's a last generation feature, there was so much backlash, they just cut a deal with them, which is the right thing to do. Like, I'm gonna be honest, even in 2020 where VR exists, motion sensitivity is not the most important thing in the vast majority of video games, and it's rarely implemented in a way where it's genuinely enjoyable, and for the most part is restricted to VR, like I said. And number 7 was the PSX DVR. It was essentially a much more home electronics version of the PlayStation 2. It was white, it was much larger, and it could record digital video. It was not released in the United States for good reason. If you translate the money, it cost about $700, which I'm sorry, And it pretty much bombed in Japan, so, I mean, duh, don't bring it over here. It's probably not something that would have done well. That's not to say there isn't a very specific niche of people who would probably like it a lot, but it would tank pretty hard. At number 6, the PlayStation TV. Perhaps one of the dopiest and strangest of all of the PlayStation ideas. It was a little set-top box that sold itself as a thing that would allow you to remote play the PS4 and use PS Now to play the PS3. Obviously, for like a $70 console, that's pretty great. In theory, you can play all those games on a little box, like a Fire TV or one of those mini consoles, and it would basically be a bunch of full console games. The problem is, the PlayStation Vita games you could also play on it were expensive. They were $20 to $40. And if you wanted to buy any other games, then you had to buy other games on your PlayStation 4. It was just a thing that ended up not working. I mean, it sucks because a lot of those Vita games just didn't get a home ever. There were a lot of great games on the Vita that no one bought or played, and that seemed like a way that people who probably weren't really that interested in buying a Vita might be able to buy a cheap thing and play them. But I mean, Android consoles, the games cost like $10 and the free-to-play was massive, and they cost about the same. At number 5, speaking of the PlayStation Vita, do you remember when Sony did tons of proprietary accessories and the PlayStation Vita came out and they did it again there? And they ensured that you had a proprietary memory card? In the cases of some games, you actually needed it to start the game. Yeah, well, they excused this by saying that the new memory cards were more secure, as if you were really that worried about people stealing your game data off the subway or something. What they meant was it was more secure for them. They were able to ensure that games were pirated less by making it very hard to get the data from them. Of course, people aren't dumb and figured out a way around it almost immediately, making a proprietary format simply irritating. If anyone really wanted to pirate PlayStation Vita games, they could. In fact, given the fact that the console itself was kind of a failure, a lot of those games you're only ever going to play if you pirate them and play them on an emulator. And at number 4, they took way too long on crossplay. It became very obvious in the last few years that crossplay would be a necessary thing. People cared way less about what brand they rep and much more about playing games with their friends. And Sony was really resistant to that, like really resistant to that. When Fortnite launched on Nintendo Switch, and people found out they wouldn't be able to even use the same account between the Switch and the PS4, forget crossplay, they didn't even allow that. It really pissed people off. People did a lot to try to get Sony to move on that. Not that people hadn't been demanding it much earlier with other games. They gave the excuse that it wasn't just like flipping a switch, which is wrong. With a game like Fortnite that uses its own proprietary accounts, they don't need to do anything other than say, you're allowed to do that, Epic Games. Which they eventually did, but it took way too long. At number 3, the Xperia Play. Remember the PlayStation phone? Sounded really cool, didn't it? They were like, hey, yeah, alright, PlayStation phone. It's a phone with a controller built in, and it's going to be a lot of fun. But it was bad. I mean, it was outwardly bad. It did have remote play, but to call it bad would just be a massive understatement. They overpromised so badly with that thing. It's an Android phone. That's it. At number 2, when they showed off quote-unquote Killzone 2 gameplay. At E3, they showed off a completely fake gameplay reel of Killzone 2. It was something that frankly looked completely impossible for the day, because it was. I mean, it's something you could probably pretty easily do with consoles today, so it's not like so far beyond the realm of possible that it's dumb, but it definitely was a kind of a lie. It definitely looked better than any of the games on that generation, particularly the fire effects. I mean, it doesn't look bad. If you go back and look at it, it's kind of cool looking, but it definitely wasn't Killzone 2 or anything on PS3. And then finally, probably the big number 1 thing they want people to forget is how much the PlayStation 3 cost when it launched. Honestly, it's gonna be hard for me ever to not harp on this one. A PS3 with a 20GB hard drive ended up costing $499, $500 for a new console. And, you know, that was when downloads kinda started. I bought more than a few games on download in that era, and 20GB is not enough. The 60GB hard drive was a $599 PlayStation console, $600. It wasn't just the storage or anything like that, though. It was the cell architecture of the console itself. And on top of having this big, complicated new technology they claimed would give it this amazing graphics capabilities, it also made it really hard to program for, and it disincentivized PlayStation 3 ports. If you want to see the evidence of why it was a nightmare, look at Skyrim on PS3. That is a bad port. But anyway, the expensive cell is part of the reason it was so expensive, and it wasn't even worth it. That's why it's such a bad mistake. What are some mistakes you can remember from Sony's history? Leave us a comment, let us know what you think, and if you like this video, please click like. If you're not subscribed, now's a great time to do so. We upload brand new